Well, hello, happy Friday, and welcome to Building a Future-Ready BCDR Strategy with Veeam and Microsoft Azure. Today's exciting webinar is sponsored by Veeam and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Jess Steinbach. I'm with Actual Tech Media, and I am absolutely thrilled to be your moderator for this webinar because things are going to be a little different this time around. Today, instead of the more traditional presentation style format that we're all used to, we're going to get the chance to jump into a discussion with two expert presenters here with us from Veeam. Together, we will explore two of the key aspects of cloud-based business continuity, migration, and backup. Our expert presenters will not only walk us through the basics of each, they will offer some in-depth insights, tips, best practices, key benefits, and tricks to avoiding the common threats to success. Our time here today will be interactive and conversational. And you get to help be in the driver's seat along with our speakers. So if you want to dig into a specific topic, speak up and ask. If you want to hear more about maybe one issue over another, if you want to clarify ideas or information, maybe you'd like to discuss something that's been on your mind, just ask. There's no script, there's no roadmap. All of us here today get to kind of choose our own adventure together. I don't want to take a single minute away from this conversation, so I'm going to zip through a few of those important housekeeping points and get us on our way. So first up, I want to draw your attention over to the question section of your webinar console because everything I was just explaining, all about the fun and excitement of a choose your own adventure style webinar, it depends on, well, you guessed it, you. The experts here today have a lot of information to cover, and they're going to tailor their discussion points to you, what you're asking, what you want to hear. So that means that now is the time to speak up, to post those questions, those comments, those topics, whatever you have on your mind. We want to hear from you throughout the webinar today. And all of that happens inside that handy dandy questions window on your audience console. So find that tab now, and let's start out by a little practice round. Say hello, say hi, give a wave to the community out there with you today. Now, as a quick side note, that window is also the best place to reach out and let us know if you do have any tech issues during the session today, knock on wood, of course. Don't forget that a browser refresh is going to get rid of any of the usual tech gremlins, but if they're really clinging on tight today, don't worry, just shoot us a message in that questions tab and the Actual Tech Media crew will be there to help. Okay, so skipping along, our next stop on our guided tour today, we're going to take a look at that handout section right next to the questions tab in your console. You're going to see some exciting content to go along with the webinar today. You can register and get the free ebook, 5 Azure Backup and Recovery Must-Haves. You can snag an on-demand webinar, Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure Backup and Recovery. So that's going to be a great follow-up from our session here today. You can get some really good info and download the free edition of Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure, plus the executive brief, 2023 Cloud Protection Trends. That is a super interesting read. It just came out, so you're getting this one hot off the presses. So go check that one out. Now, it is not just awesome content that we're giving away today. We also have a $300 Amazon gift card as a prize drawing at the end of our webinar. Now, you do need to be here live in attendance at the webinar in order to qualify for the prize, and all winners must meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. If you're not sure what those are, no problem. You can find the full T's and C's right there in the handouts tab. Just click in and scroll down to the bottom there. Not only does asking questions today help steer the conversation and bring up the overall excitement and energy of the whole webinar, which it really does, it is also a great chance to win a prize. So today we're offering a $50 Amazon gift card to the best question asked. Now we're going to review all the questions asked after we wrap today. So even if we don't get to your question live in our discussion here, there's still a chance to win that. So keep those questions coming in because it's going to get some cool conversations going. And hey, you just might win a bonus $50 gift card today. All right, well, that was it for the housekeeping. I told you I would keep it short and sweet, and now we are ready to start our awesome webinar. I am so excited to introduce you all to Johan Hatenga, Microsoft Azure Solution Architect at Veeam, and Leah Trushanecki, Principal PMM for Microsoft Azure Solutions at Veeam. So let's get these awesome humans out here with us. Leah and Johan, I can't wait to start this conversation today. I know you have a lot of awesome content to cover. So Leah, I'm going to hand the mic right on over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jess. Well, that energy, we're just going to try to keep it up on a Friday. So Welcome everybody to our presentation today. I'll show you our faces again on another slide. Again, my name is Leah Trishnecki, Leah T for short. Please don't feel like you have to be able to pronounce my last name. It's a lot. Today, we're going to be talking about how to build a future-ready solution for business continuity and disaster recovery with Veeam and, of course, Microsoft Azure. So for those of you on the call today, please let us know in the chat if you guys are current users of Microsoft Azure, if you're exploring Azure's solution and you kind of want to know maybe where it would fit into your backup strategy. That'll give us some good fodder as we're looking through our slides today, because as Jess said, I don't want this to be a death by PowerPoint. We are not going to shove a bunch of features and functionality down everybody on a Friday. We want to keep this really interesting and conversational for you. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is a lot of research, because ultimately I think, yes, we can chat with our peers and we can get some really good anecdotes about what's going on in the market, but ultimately getting a bird's eye view of what's happening with organizations like us can give us a good picture of where we stand today, where we need to move to tomorrow, what are some of the the considerations we need to have when we're thinking about purchasing or design or even optimizing what you're currently doing today. So hopefully we can give you guys some good food for thought. And then of course, the Veeam team is always here to help if you want to chat afterwards about what your current setup looks like and how we might be able to help, because ultimately we really don't have time in today's day and age of ransomware and workloads moving to 100 different places for any gaps to be had in a backup strategy. And let's talk about that backup strategy for a second and what those gaps might look like. At Veeam, ever since I worked here, we've been talking a long time about something we lovingly refer to as the availability gap. Now, ultimately, we fulfill a business continuity and disaster recovery strategy with capabilities like backup and recovery and replication. But when we're really thinking about the impact to the business, it's all about, is my data and services available to my end users, whether those end users are fellow employees like Jan in finance, or whether that's Tom, my customer purchasing from me. Is the data and services ultimately going to be available to them on a continuous basis? And when we poll customers time and time again, and specifically this is from our data protection trends report, which we run every year with a third-party agency, ultimately these users say, no, I have absolutely an availability gap, whether that's agree as in, yeah, I'm aware that it's completely possible that at any given time my services can go down and I don't have the tolerance for it, or it's a strong agree. I'm very painfully aware I'm running a legacy solution and I need help. That's really what we're talking about today. And ultimately, that creates some pretty negative impacts to the business. And when we look at negative impacts to the business, it all boils down to impacts to brand. So whether that be customers choosing to go with one of my competitors because my website was down and they couldn't transact, or because I couldn't get back to them within a day, my email server went down, or it could be internal issues. It could have cost time and productivity. There could even be legal action with something like GDPR compliance requirements. So ultimately, we're not just talking about backup here. We're really talking about making sure that we're able to uphold the needs of the IT part of any given business. And it's interesting as we talk about IT, because back in the day, we were talking about desktops and servers and some software. And as technology has evolved with virtualization and other really cool components, it's gotten more complicated. But now that workloads are moving progressively into the cloud, whether it's SaaS clouds, or certainly infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, it's getting a lot more complicated about where the responsibility lies. And we're going to talk a lot today about responsibility, unfortunately. Who's responsible for making sure that this data is available and in what context? This is actually something called the shared responsibility model, and this is published by Microsoft. I used to work for Microsoft. I took a lot of Microsoft certification. I saw the shared responsibility model in nearly every cert that I took. That's because they want to make it very clear where the responsibility lies in the infrastructure stack. Yes, Microsoft will always make sure that the servers themselves are available, that you've got a networking connection to it, but data is ultimately the responsibility of the customer. And I think a lot of folks sort of understand that in concept, but it doesn't really hit in reality until something bad happens, until somebody deletes a massive part of the infrastructure and you have to recover it. And oh gosh, well, there isn't just this nice recycling bin I can pull from. It needs to be much more sophisticated than that. And that's where Veeam can step in. We can really provide the right size solution for whatever the recovery need is for these customers. So with that, that's some setting the stage content. We're now going to get into some really cool research and talk about a couple of different topics within the realm of BCDR. And the first one's going to be top threats to business continuity and disaster recovery. And again, this all comes from research that we do with an outside firm. And we're not just surveying Veeam customers, we're surveying organizations of all sizes in many different countries to say, when you're looking at business continuity, what is going to keep you up at night? What are the big issues that you foresee? And a lot of the issues boil down to issues that could happen uniquely to an on-premises infrastructure or even an edge part of your infrastructure. But a lot of the threats also apply to cloud-based workloads. And Johan, this is where I'm going to bring you in. I know we talk a lot about cybersecurity in the industry. It's certainly the hot button topic. But when we looked at this research, that was absolutely top of mind for these end users. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the ways that cybersecurity really impacts business continuity and some key ways that maybe we can help?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I also see you guys are starting to ask questions as well. So that's really exciting. There's some topics that are related to this in the thread, and I'll try and touch on some of those. So companies, 76% based on research, had a ransomware attack in 2021. That's terrifying, right? And so how do
Yeah.
we deal with that, right? It's no longer that you have a disaster and you have to worry about things in the global scale from a fire, etc. perspective. This is just the main issue now. And so backup becomes your last line of defense, but how do you prove that backup is in a way usable when that happens? How do you make sure that you have all of the things in place you need to be ready for a situation where you get hit by ransomware? And how do you detect ransomware before it infects your backups, right? You don't want to have backups be polluted by the data that ransomware is now encrypting or adding viruses, etc. So there's lots of things there where we have to worry more than we ever did about cybersecurity. And so from a perspective there, Veeam has a bunch of features that allow you to verify your backups, allows you to detect ransomware with integrations with various antivirus products, and allows you to do things like instant VM recovery, so instant recovery, but then in a staged environment where you can make sure that you run additional scans before you restore your data, so you know that the data you're restoring is secure. You can also go further. You could potentially look at event data and integrate that with a security monitoring solution if you wanted. There's a lot of ways to address this, and it's hard to kind of do that in one soundbite, if you will. But as we continue to go through this discussion, I'm sure we'll talk about it more. Various customers have had attacks that we know of as well, that are customers of ours, and they may have not implemented the right best practices. So you can learn from that as well, so that you don't become that next person that gets attacked.
Yeah, and in fact, we recommend whenever we're chatting with customers that one of the first steps you take if you are hit with ransomware is to call technical support. Because ultimately, we've seen it before and we can help walk you through how Veeam can help. That also helps us learn and we build those best practices into future releases of the solution. We're absolutely going to talk more about cybersecurity and ransomware. I have more research to back this up. And in fact, there's a couple of really amazing detailed questions in here from Eric and Patrick about some cybersecurity methodologies and how we can best equip. We're going to get to those in just a couple more sections. But first, I think we need to lay the groundwork a little bit and talk about Veeam solutions specifically, because ultimately, as you can see here with some of these bottom stats, on-premises infrastructure has many failure points, whether it's networking or at the software layer, or a natural disaster is coming and your entire data center is going to get wiped out. And that's really the beauty of the cloud ultimately, is some of those high availability principles. So just to give you guys a quick review, the Veeam platform ultimately can solve many challenges. We back up VMware vSphere, Hyper-V, physical Windows servers. We have a great solution for Microsoft 365 that can back up a ton of the services within 365. In the context of Azure, I'm going to give you two simple ways of looking at the Veeam platform. The first is that you can back up directly to the Microsoft Azure cloud. And that's really exciting because it opens up a lot of possibilities, not only for long-term data retention, which we're going to talk about again, with more research coming up here soon. But you can also use it for a lot of the highly technical capabilities provided by Azure. Again, more to come. The other big thing that we do is backup of Microsoft Azure. Now, in years past, when Veeam talked about our cloud story, we talked about it in terms of agents. So taking an agent-based approach and backing workloads up. And you can absolutely still use Veeam agents to back up cloud-based workloads. But in the last few years, we have come out with cloud native solutions specifically for Microsoft Azure services. So you can back up infrastructure as a service, platform as a service offerings with the Veeam platform and centrally manage it within the Veeam backup and replication console. And I think that's a really exciting prospect because as we talked about some of those emergencies, and I'll flip back to the research here, there's lots of opportunities for a failure to happen even within the cloud. So something as simple as an accidental deletion happening every day. Well, Azure has lots of really great replication technology built in, but you don't necessarily need a backhoe in order to just, fill a hole. So it's a great opportunity for you to come in with something that's more elegant and easier designed and more intuitive to execute that kind of recovery on something as simple as an accidental deletion. We're going to talk more about what modern backup looks like, including this cloud native capability. But Johan, anything to add before we move on?
No, I think that really sums it up very well. And there are many reasons you would use kind of a continuity of protection model, right? Where you would have used Veeam on premises traditionally, or you could use Veeam to migrate your workloads into Azure. And we can talk about that a little bit later as well. And then you continue to use Veeam solution, but then inside Azure to protect the data there. And there are various ways to address the resilience of that data. But we keep getting more questions on this topic. This is great. Let's talk about
Yeah, it's
modern
great.
backup strategy. Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's go ahead and move on. And then again, guys, we'll keep coming to some questions live, and then we'll get through a lot of the questions at the end of the call too. So please make sure to stay tuned. But with that, let's talk about modern backup. And again, I know that sounds like a messaging term, but we're actually taking this from research. So we surveyed these organizations and said, if you were to modernize your backup solution, again, you may be running a solution you purchased 10 years ago, the world has changed. What would modern backup mean to you? And this is just a smattering of some of the things that they mentioned. I pulled these obviously specifically for this conversation, but you can download the full report too to really get a good sense of what modern backup means to the breadth of organizations we surveyed. One of the top answers, though, was standardization between on-premises and the cloud. As workloads rapidly move to the cloud, whether that's because of server shortages and the supply chain issues we've been having, whether that's because truly the organization believes that the cloud is the best place for these workloads, it's easy to create gaps in your availability strategy as those workloads move to the cloud. And so having everything in one place, looking at it from a policy approach rather than an individual workload approach, that really seems to be what a lot of organizations believe makes up a modern solution. But as part of that, being able to account for mobility. I mean, as much as we would love to sit here and plan out IT projects, that's not always what happens. And so you need to be able to move on the fly and take those backups with you. A lot of organizations are also looking to make their lives easier. Ultimately, backup is something that is a cost center for any IT department. It's not considered the most attractive output of an IT department. So ultimately, if we can embed or automate any sort of workflows for backup and recovery, that's going to make a solution modern. And then finally, again, we're going to talk a lot about security in a bit here, but integrating within a broader cybersecurity strategy, that continues to be really top of mind for organizations. Now, what's beautiful about the Veeam platform, as I said, is ultimately we have a breadth of workload coverage. And not only is that great from the perspective of making sure that we don't have availability gaps, it's also great because we're taking some of the really well optimized and well thought out capabilities that we started with and making them applicable to a lot of these workloads. So you don't sit here from an R&D perspective and build over and over again the same thing for each one of these workloads. It's all centralized in one place so that you can elevate the backup across all of these workloads. Johan, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, as you keep going, right? This is not just the cloud, SaaS, and virtual. I think we're looking at Kubernetes now, and we're looking at what the future of applications look like. And as we, take you through this journey, or as a customer, you know, even Veeam as a company, we look at the data that we produce on premises. We then, go, okay, that makes more sense in the cloud. And now our applications are evolving further, and we have solutions for that as well. Right? We help with backup for Kubernetes as well. There's a lot more to this, and hopefully we can talk about the ubiquity of what this means, and backing up to the cloud is becoming more and more popular as supply chain issues happen. And where else can you store data where you don't have to go, okay, I have to do budget planning for the next half a year, and how much is my data going to grow? I don't know. It becomes really hard.
Couldn't find the mute button for a second. Thank you so much, Johan. It absolutely does become really hard to execute. And from there, that's where we'll try to break some of the solution story out. So one of the things that can be really difficult is thinking about data retention. So let's talk about data retention. And we have some really good questions already about that. So the instincts are already there with the audience, which is great. Um, Fortunately, I've been in this space for a decade, and I remember the days where I had to convince customers to back up to the cloud, and that's no longer really a conversation. Our research shows us that backup to the cloud is near ubiquitous at this point, that organizations are completely bought into the idea of moving at least some of their work or some of their backups meant for long-term retention off of tape, or in addition to tape, moving them into the cloud. And in fact, this is where you'll get some brand new hot off the presses research. We actually surveyed infrastructure as a service administrators. So think Azure engineers, Azure admins, and we asked them, when it comes to your cloud hosted data, what is the length of time that you typically try to retain that data? Because ultimately, when we're talking about tape, it's oftentimes write once, read never, keep it in a closet. You might remember to deprecate them after 7, 10 years, or they might just get washed away in a flood. Who knows? But when it comes to hosting data in the cloud, there's a tremendous amount of benefit, yet it costs money. So that's where you have to be really intentional about how long you truly need to host that data, and making sure that you're really tracking how long that data has been hosted so that you can deprecate it. So this gives you a sense of, again, organizations like you, how long do they think that they need to host this data? And there's truly a breadth of answers. Obviously, that's likely because each workload has a different kind of retention requirement, whether it's because of regulatory compliance needs or some other kind of factor. But ultimately, I think the big theme here is that you need a solution that can intelligently track how long this data is being hosted. So, Victor, I know you had a question about retention and how many days is the default retention offered. Ultimately, within the Veeam solutions, you can set that information for you. So, Johan, can you talk to us a little bit about Scale Up Backup Repository, and maybe even give us a teaser of what's to come in the next release?
Sure. Yeah. So as a person backing up data on premises, for example, or if I have a hybrid environment, I could stage my data to a local location. My backup, will perform best if I have it run somewhere locally. At least that was the traditional thought. Um, then you could stage it onto capacity tier, which would be Azure Blob Hot or Cool. And then it could go to archive tier. When it goes to archive tier, the block size changes, the data structure changes a little bit, because we make sure that each data layout is most optimized for the cost of that tier. Sort of like if you were to think about doing tape. Thankfully, we don't have to do that anymore. And you have archive tier on Azure for that instead. In the future, in a few months' time with Veeam Backup and Replication version 12, we will have the ability to go direct to Azure Blob, which will be great for remote and branch office sites where you might have capacity problems with figuring out where am I going to send my data to. I've figured that in some large data centers, you might still want to send data to local disk first, simply because your internet speeds might not match the speeds you need to write to disk. Some of our large enterprise customers will write, to arrays that could do multiple tens of gigabytes a second, which would be quite an expensive direct route into Azure, but you could buy that as well. So effectively giving you much more choice and flexibility going forward. But the whole tiering and automated logic here is really useful. It makes it really easy for you to go, okay, I have a job, the data needs to go somewhere. Let's have Veeam handle that for me, and then kind of do the lifecycle management and grandfather, father, son logic for that.
Absolutely. And Johan, do you want to give us a teaser of maybe what's to come in the next release?
Sure, sorry. Yeah. So with version 12, we'll be able to write directly to Azure, not just for Veeam backup and replication, but also for the agent workloads, which means you don't have to have local disk really at all. And I could take my laptop and send a backup of it to Azure, and then if my laptop happened to be important, which maybe it is, or the executive's laptop, I could then boot it up as a VDI image or something like that. Obviously, it would just be a Windows VM in Azure if I wanted to. Now, some of that would take a little bit of restore work, right? But if it's already in Azure Blob, the restore will be pretty fast as well. There's other things coming, but for now, I'll just talk about what's changing to the scale-out backup repository and the ability to send data to Azure directly.
Fantastic. And that's really what's cool about the Veeam platform is ultimately we're really trying to keep up with continuous innovation. So with the cloud native solutions, for example, we typically have a few releases each year. And a lot of the features that we include in those releases come from feedback on webinars like this, on our forums. We're really trying to keep up to date with what users are experiencing because, again, we recognize that the storage space is rapidly changing and the needs that you have are rapidly changing with it. So this is where it's really great to get this kind of feedback and really commit to that story of innovation. So certainly more to come on the scale up backup repository front and ultimately on the object storage front too.
Yeah,
So
and
with
there was
that,
an
let's
interesting
change gears a
question
little
that,
bit.
sorry, I wanted to address a question
Go ahead.
about housing data centers, if that's okay. So if we're talking about
Yes.
locations, and we don't host your data. Veeam as a company has solutions that can either be used by a partner, probably one you already know, so that you can use them as a service provider for your backup, or you can host your own. That's typically how it works. We find that backup has so much gravity that it's nicer to have you do this with somebody that knows you well as a business. And we are a global company with 450,000 customers. It's easier for us to do that in a way that scales, right? And then you as a customer have the most control. You can actually deploy Veeam solutions directly from the Azure marketplace as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really been part of our story for a long time is that we're software defined, storage agnostic. So we port anywhere. We're customized for you, meaning as Johan said, if you were in a different country or if your organization operates in multiple countries, you have the option to say, I want to back up to Azure, or I want to back up with a proprietary local cloud, or I want to use my own hardware. You have the opportunity to do that. So that's a great call out, great question, Mark. All right, let's shift gears and talk about what I think a lot of the hot button questions are that we have sitting in our chat here, which is all about cybersecurity. And, again, I'm sure you've heard this on countless webinars and countless other pieces of content before, but the threat of cybersecurity is really a matter of when, not if. So on the business continuity and DR front, it's all about how can you make sure that your backups are secure, meaning not infected by ransomware. How can you control access to those backups? And ultimately, are you capable of recovering when a threat like this happens? And so we surveyed these users and we asked them, what are the biggest impacts to your business as a result of ransomware? And we specifically surveyed users who said that they had some kind of ransomware attack. And thematically, again, it all came down to loss of services to their end users, ultimately financial impacts, whether that was a loss of productivity or having to pay fines. It may have even been customer facing issues like a negative impact to brand reputation. And we hear so many of these stories in the news. The pain is very real. And a lot of the times that's because these workloads aren't always recoverable. We had some really great questions from a few of you guys early on in the conversation about what do we do to prevent a scenario in which we have a backup, we're confident it can be recovered, but it somehow got infected. So, Johan, can you talk to us a little bit about what that sort of backup infection process looks like and how we make sure that we prevent it?
Yeah, no, I like that. So if you were hit by ransomware, usually the story is that it takes about 180 days, or this is a rather drastic number. It may be lower, I hope, right? For the organization to detect that this has happened. At that point, of course, your backups are quite old. And so they start with a little server somewhere in your environment. They start to get used to your environment, and eventually they feel confident enough to attack you at full scale. Usually that number of 180 might be a bit lower. But what we can do is we can integrate with antivirus products from a secure restore perspective. And at that point, you will be able to scan your backup before you restore it to make sure it doesn't have any issues. And you can also, if you really wanted to, you could have a little bit of logic in your job with a pre-job script that could talk to your antivirus before you back up too. Now, hopefully, we get smarter about this as the world evolves. I'm hoping that we detect ransomware faster, and that is on the security solution side, and there are some ways to link Veeam to that as well. But once you've restored your data, you can keep going, right? And often we'll find that customers that have been hit by a ransomware attack have to treat their primary data center as a crime scene while they figure it all out. And so this is why using Azure is so cool from a backup perspective. You can just restore your workloads directly from Azure Blob into Azure VM and use direct restore from Veeam, which is actually faster on Azure than the other clouds. We also, in version 6 of Veeam Disaster Recovery Orchestrator, which I don't know if anyone's followed that, will allow you to manage that at slightly more scale, effectively manage a whole plan for this, and do restores at scale from this, effectively making your Azure DR site a very valuable part of this whole story.
Absolutely. And, ultimately, when we're thinking about this recovery story from a ransomware perspective, there's a couple of key beats I want to leave you guys with, which is first and foremost, you have to make sure you have a reliable recovery story. And recovery means a lot of different things in the cloud space. So, especially when you're talking about Azure based workloads, yes, you can restore a snapshot, but is that the right approach in these kinds of situations? Another one would be access and control. So making sure that you're securing access and monitoring that access, whether it's with role-based access controls, Active Directory. There's lots of opportunities to make sure you're controlling access. And then finally, making sure that when you're in that crime scene scenario, like Johan just described, that you're not sitting here wondering, how do I even do this? How do I even execute this kind of recovery? So making sure that this is an easy button situation. You don't want to have a cumbersome backup solution. You want to make sure that it's already well thought out by experts like Veeam to make sure that you're ready to go when you're otherwise panicking and having to deal with a lot of other issues in that sort of cybersecurity space. So those are some things we wanted to leave you with. If you do have more questions about this ransomware piece, please continue to use the question function. We'd love to hear from you, and we're happy to go back to this topic. But we are going to shift gears a little bit and talk about lift and shift to the cloud. I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of factors of why workloads are moving from on-premises to the cloud. And what we're finding is, as that's happening, there's some interesting new scenarios occurring that we're having to account for as we think about workload mobility, and especially where backup fits into that mobility equation. So in the last few years, as part of our Cloud Protection Trends Report, and again, this is a piece of research that we just published yesterday, so you guys are getting hot off the presses information. When we've asked this question before, has your organization brought any workloads back from public cloud onto an on-premises server? We usually got a very different spread of answers. It used to be about 50% no, we've never had to do that. And then the rest was, yeah, we did that because there was a disaster scenario. That was a low amount. We had a decent amount that said, yeah, we did dev tests in the cloud and always plan to bring it back on premises. But that middle one where it said we migrated to the cloud and then decided to bring it back on premises, that was a much lower number. And in the last year, we've seen a tremendous amount of that. And ultimately, when we've been talking with customers about this feedback, because this was, I think, one of the more shocking pieces of research we saw, we heard a lot of really interesting stories about, corporate imperatives. Let's say, for example, an organization says, hey, we've made a decision that we need to migrate 50% of our workloads to the cloud. Start bagging and tagging which ones you want to move, and we'll start that migration process. They do that and they find, gosh, it doesn't work. Apologies, I just needed to cough for a second. And that's where some of these stories have been really interesting, because ultimately we find that these users have had to scramble to find a new home for these workloads when it no longer worked in the cloud. And again, as they scramble, backup is forgotten. security protocols
Yeah.
might be forgotten. And then all of a sudden you're opening yourself up to risk. Johan, do you want to talk a little bit about this and maybe some stories you've heard?
Sure. I mean, there's definitely some interesting popular stories right now that kind of have circled around. Um, it's really weird to think that if you are going to take your legacy infrastructure, right, your on-premises infrastructure and the power bills and all of that stuff that it comes with it, and you lift and shift it to the cloud without moving and improving something along the way, that you wouldn't be metered on your bad design choices that you had from on-premises, right? And so I think some of this is that. Some of this is the customer goes on premises, I paid one bill once and I never saw it again. And now I'm being metered on these choices. So now I can see that in real life. And I think the cloud has a lot of power and flexibility to, encourage you to improve things and reduce your bill significantly. But if you don't take advantage of it, then you might be surprised, right? And that really is just a question of how you adopt cloud and what kind of tech adopter you are as a business. And often that means you have to weigh a lot of different priorities, whether that's innovation, keeping the lights on, mitigating disaster like we've been talking about today. And so maybe that's where this 43% is coming from, because I think it's way too high. I don't think this is normal, right? But you do need to have a way to manage this, and you need to have a way for your data to be portable. And you need to make sure that you can monitor your workloads and back them up for all intensive purposes wherever they are. And Veeam gives you some really good tools for that. And I think that's where this is valuable. This is a very weird data point to me, though. I did not expect this. And I think there's definitely the opportunity to spend several hours on this topic, but I don't know if we have
Absolutely.
time.
I know. And certainly we'd love to hear from you guys in the Q&A. If you've ever experienced moving a workload and there's a story you want to share, we would love to hear that because Johan was shocked, I was shocked. So many of our folks in product strategy were shocked. I actually had the great privilege last week of being in Prague, and I presented this to some of our top Veeam end users. So we have two organizations at Veeam where we kind of try to provide access and benefits to users who are really active on our forums and on their own blogs and present on webinars. It's called our Veeam Vanguard community and our Veeam Legends community. We brought all of them together in Prague and had a lot of really great conversations. I put this slide up and I actually showed the previous year and this year's data. I think we talked about it for 20 minutes and I had to cut the conversation off because we had other topics to get to. So certainly, drop in the Q&A if you have any thoughts about this topic. It's super interesting. I think one in particular that we talked about was, some of what may be causing this is you rapidly move a workload to the cloud and you may not be right sizing it to the correct services. We were taking a look at our research and asking, are you leveraging Azure database services today? Or are you just lifting and shifting those databases from on-premises to an Azure VM? And we continue to be really surprised that so many users will just move it up into a VM instead of taking some of those extra steps to completely migrate it to a database service. Obviously, there's a tremendous amount of reasons for that. So I layered this on with another piece of research we have from our data protection trends report, to ultimately talking about what gets in the way of your ability to transform, whether it's moving to the cloud or some other kind of transformation initiative. Lack of that expertise is always top of the list. So I think that's really a big part of it, and all the more reason why, webinars like this, but certainly certifications and other opportunities to grow our skill sets and stay up to date. That's where a lot of this really comes in. Ultimately, though, when we look at how Veeam can help with this is again where I think Veeam continues to excel, because when we were talking about this with our influencer community, I asked, what are some of the ways that Veeam can help? And the number one answer was the fact that Veeam is portable is kind of the whole point. The fact that Veeam is able to back up so many different kinds of workloads with a similar DNA. I mean, truly the Veeam experience across backing up an Azure VM versus backing up a Hyper-V VM on-prem versus backing up a laptop in somebody's home, it's all really similar in a look and feel. So it's really easier for you to port that around and keep the backup with it. But we also have things like a portable file format for the VBK file, the Veeam backup file. We even have something called Veeam Universal Licensing, which basically is an entitlement process where you can unlock protection of pretty much any workload that's in the Veeam platform. There's a few extents that are outside of that licensing schema, the biggest one being Veeam Backup for 365. But that kind of naturally makes sense because ultimately SaaS is a different sort of beast. But when it comes from an infrastructure perspective, that license format can take you anywhere. And as you move workloads back and forth, as it seems, I think that licensing format is a really big part of it. Johan, anything you want to add before we talk about some final thoughts and then move into questions?
Sure, yeah. I think this is a really fascinating problem, right? You have to move your data around. Egress in cloud is really expensive, so we find that sometimes people will store data in one cloud and then if they need to, they age it out. Say you're migrating from on-premises and you have a hybrid solution, you're going to do everything on Azure. You may not take your 7 years of tape with you to Azure, right? Um, but the other fascinating part is that the bills in cloud, you know, might be problematic in some ways if you don't ever improve your workload. But I think that if you do, you can make a lot of headway from an innovation perspective, and then using cloud actually becomes worth it, right? Because the value, and I think this was weird about the survey, is the cost was considered as part of a reason to leave cloud, but what was the value for adopting the cloud, right? And people don't always understand that. And so if we were to look at using Azure native services, there's a lot of value you can have from those extra services like Azure SQL, like some of the things that Azure Functions offer. And so there's a lot there to be explored. And as we back up Azure natively with Veeam Backup for Azure in the marketplace, you'll see that we'll add support for more of those features going forward. Right now we support Azure SQL, Azure VM, and Azure Files. And as customers adopt more, and based on discussions here, but also in forums and our existing customer base, you'll see that we continue to broaden our support for Azure.
Absolutely. We're certainly invested in the Azure partnership. We're very fortunate that we have a great relationship with Microsoft, and I think you'll continue to see that innovation and that ultimately that customer support. It's a really big part of it. And our definition of
Yeah.
support continues to evolve because who we work with has been evolving. So, one final thing we want to leave you with before we flip to some of these awesome questions that we haven't gotten to live is who's involved in data protection. When we've historically been in the market, when we've had user conferences, when we have gone to, let's say, Microsoft Ignite and somebody's come up to our booth, 9 times out of 10, it's somebody with backup in their title. It's a backup administrator. But what we're finding in the last few years is whoever owns the workload, whether it's the 365 admin, whether it's the Azure engineer, they now have, and they actually recognize that they have some kind of responsibility for backing up these workloads or making sure that they are in fact backed up. But what was interesting about this research data, and again, you guys are seeing hot off the presses research here, we actually cut the data by persona. So when we surveyed Azure engineer versus backup admin versus director of IT, when we took a look at who answered this question, it became really interesting because let's say the Azure engineers, they said, yes, I'm supposed to be involved, but it's ultimately the data protection team's job. And then when we surveyed the data protection teams and said, whose job is it to back up cloud hosted workloads? Well, there was a lot more of them pointing to the Azure team saying the Azure guys are responsible for that. So it seems like there's kind of, I almost envision it as like the Spider-Man meme where all the Spider-Mans are pointing at each other saying, oh, that's you, that's you. It's kind of a
It's not really that
responsibility
different
gap
from
in a lot of ways.
yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's not dissimilar actually from the traditional world where we had like an IT team and they had a SQL team and a network team and a DBA team
Yes.
and they were all doing different things, and yet they all thought each other was responsible. It hasn't changed at all.
Yeah, it's fascinating how that continues to happen in IT and be a theme. But we wanted to flip that to you guys in the audience because I think that's a really great challenge for you is to go back to your organizations and try to figure out who is currently protecting these workloads today, who's got it figured out, because I think you might find that there's some gaps. And the second that you don't realize you've got a gap in your strategy is when ransomware sneaks in or somebody deletes a major part of a database and all of a sudden you don't have an answer for it. And that's where things can really get dicey. So I think this is a good challenge for everybody in the audience to take a step back, go back to their organizations and see, gosh, where do we have some kind of challenge? But with that, Johan, I think we wanted to flip it over to questions. So Jess, can you pop back in and help us out?
Yeah, Leah, Johan, that was so wonderful. A really, really interesting discussion. And I really do want to call out for the audience out there that's been sending in questions and comments. It's been really fun to kind of hear Leah and Johan be able to adapt and react to the comments that are coming in. So thank you so much for jumping on board and participating. We do have a few questions that we haven't got to, so let's dive into some audience Q&A. You guys all set?
Let's go.
All right, let's do it. Really, I was kind of laughing about the Spider-Man meme. That's a great analogy for that.
Always.
Okay, let's start with this one here from Jeffrey. He's just wondering, what is the smallest amount of data to protect for a cost-effective solution?
Gosh, that's going to be
That's a
tough because
fascinating question.
ultimately it depends on your application, right? How
Yeah.
important is that app? How long can you have it down for? So there's two key measurables that you want to think about to answer that question. The first is recovery point objectives. And this is an industry term that's been around longer than I've probably been alive. The idea being, at what point in time can you tolerate losing an amount of data? For example, if something goes down and you lose an hour of data, right? You didn't back something up for an hour. Is that tolerable for that app? Maybe, right? There's a lot of apps that could go down for a day and it would suck. But from a cost perspective, maybe that's okay. There's other apps that you have a very low tolerance for. You could probably only lose 10 minutes of data. Otherwise, you're losing a massive part of your business continuity. So that's one answer to think about. The second answer is recovery time objective. We talked a bit about recovery options and how sometimes you don't want a massive tool for something you need a small shovel for. That's what recovery time objective is all about. How long does it take you to recover? If it takes you an entire day to recover an app that's not that important, okay, maybe that's fine. But again, for an app that's really, really important, a whole day is 1 day lost of productivity, and that may not be tolerable for your business. So to answer that question, Jeffrey, those are the two things to think about per workload that you're backing up. What is the point in time that you could tolerate that amount of data being lost? And how long can you tolerate that recovery time being?
I like that. Johan, anything that you wanted to add to that?
I think the final thought is we know what that is in theory, right? If you have the business people explain that to you, you'll be surprised because everything suddenly is important. But the next question
Ah,
is,
yes.
how much are they going to pay for that, right? Because somebody has to
Mm,
pay for that resource to be live in Azure. And so then the next question is, okay, that is really important to you, but what is the cost of downtime? And then are you willing to, I'm the group services IT department, are you willing to stand by that? Like if I have a disaster, will you pay for this thing to be up? Whatever that looks like, I don't know your financial resources or how that works, but that affects a lot more sometimes than what you want as the desired RPO.
well, we're getting a lot of questions coming in around this. Clearly, cost is top of mind for a lot of people right now, and making effective decisions around that, which you kind of addressed a bit. I'll just go. Richard just asked, does Veeam have any ability to report on the amount of backup storage or cost being used by various workloads and the various tiers used?
Yes, yes. So the backup jobs in Veeam Backup for Azure, when you create one, it'll actually show you what you're doing. So if you change how many days you're keeping it for, it actually, in the top right corner, it shows you what the cost is of every change you make. So it's really easy to kind of go, okay, this is great, but like the last conversation we just had, but this will cost me $200 more, so I have to budget more. Now, Veeam Backup on premises, Veeam backup and replication traditionally does not show that, but it also doesn't get metered the same way. And there you can see how much usage you have, and there you have a separate reporting tool which you can add to the package, if you will. And Veeam One allows you to do forecasting and all kinds of analysis to help you buy more storage when you need to. So it kind of depends on your use case. In the cloud, we show you what it does to the meters, and on premises, we help you predict the usage.
Hmm. Okay. If somebody's got a hybrid situation, Ashu's wondering if we're sending backups from Azure to another cloud, is Veeam able to help in any way with egress data transfer costs?
Ah, yeah. So there are different ways to optimize it, but it depends on your scenario. It actually kind of comes back down to what Leah was talking about, is how long do you have to keep your data for? And so are we migrating our data? Are we keeping our data for a long time? Are we finding certain systems that aren't as important as others? And so that kind of determines the priority of which data goes first and whether you want to keep your backup data with it or not. You can't completely avoid egress, right? The cloud is going to charge you money every time you use bandwidth. So you have to kind of accept that as a limitation of physics as well. You can't completely get out of it. But there are some ways with WAN acceleration and other tricks you can play. Mostly the tricks are, prioritizing what you're moving. You can make that a little bit cheaper.
I'm going to ask this question here from Laura, who's wondering if you could give us an idea of sort of what is unique about Veeam. What makes your solution really stand out?
I think if you look at our popularity in the market, the customers kind of speak for themselves. And we do really try to listen to our customer feedback for each version that we come out with. And hopefully it's still as easy to use as it was a few years ago. We have a lot more functionality than we did then. When our tagline was, it just works. And that generally is still the main design goal behind our product, right? You do want to remember to keep in mind some of the sizing things we just discussed, right? And
Right.
that's why it can be a little more complicated. You have to think about the planning of everything. But apart from that, the user interface, if it doesn't just work, then you can send me an email, right?
And ultimately, on that planning front, when we're thinking about storage, again, we are a software only solution. So we work with a lot of different storage vendors. For example, we're talking a lot about Azure today as a storage target, but we do work with Pure Storage, or on the object storage side, we work with a solution like Wasabi. And actually, we have a really strong relationship with Wasabi's object storage solution. We have a lot of service providers that even offer backup as a service based on Wasabi. So ultimately, when we're looking at that story of how are we different than some of the other backup solutions out there, I think that storage choice is a really big part of that. We can work with pretty much any storage vendor that you've worked with before. And I think that's a big one.
I love that. And that answers a question Mark also had about, who else you might work with. So that's good to know that there's some flexibility there. Since there
And
were
you
a lot
could
of
use
questions.
one and restore in another.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, no. That's important information. Sorry, Johan, I think I was speaking over you. So can you repeat that for our audience as well?
Yeah, so Wasabi, for example, doesn't have its own compute. So you could restore the workload from Wasabi into Azure as a VM, for example. I'm sorry for the interruption.
No, you're the speaker. I'm actually on that note. So Microsoft has its own tools. Is there a reason that you'd want to go with the Veeam Azure Backup versus something that maybe comes native with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think that there are some UX related differences, right? And I think you'll see that if you ever try Veeam. And there's some scope limitation too. So Azure Backup has a lot of power when it comes to Azure, but it's not going to look outside of it. And a lot of the things we discussed today were not just Azure, but what you do in a hybrid world where you maybe manage backup for more than one thing. And then you want to centralize the management of that, or you want to restore stuff into Azure, or you may be looking for more flexibility from a scheduling perspective.
Love that. Okay. And I'm just checking here through our questions. I think since there were, and we're getting close to the end of our time here. Wow, that went by so fast, folks, I have to say. Since there were quite a few questions about cost, could you maybe give us like a high level picture of how all of this could potentially help save money for organizations? Because that seems to be top of mind for a lot of folks out there.
Leah, do you want to take that one or should I try?
Yeah, no, I'll start and then you add in the color. So, from a cost perspective, there's two ways to think of this. When you look at other solutions in the space, again, I think we're really unique that we are a software only solution. So when you're looking at those other solutions, they're really adding up both the storage and the software component of it. So let me extrapolate those two. On the software side of things, on our side, we have really flexible purchasing options. The main ones being subscription based. So you can really tier it based on what kind of subscription solution you want, how much coverage do you want, are you just using it for Azure? Are you using it for more of your workloads? Do you want to transition over time? That flexibility is really there. And we ultimately work with the channel. So a lot of our channel partners can provide you really good financing options to try to make sure that we're finding the best fit cost for you. And then on the storage side, that's again where choice really comes into play. If you want to leverage existing storage, if you want to use Azure, if you want to start in Wasabi, restore in Azure, as Johan said, there's so many different options. And I think that that choice can really play a big factor of how you can control your cost. But the biggest way to help control the cost is the fact that Veeam is thinking with cost in mind. So from a design perspective, for example, you look at something like scale out backup repository, it is very rare that you need to keep a backup in something like performance tier for very long. So if you tier that out to lower cost storage, that's going to help you save cost. And in the future, with our cloud native solutions, you can back up directly to object storage. So if you're already saying, hey, listen, my recovery time objective is much more flexible, I can go ahead and store this in object storage, save it for a rainy day, and I can control those costs that way. So again, we're really trying to work with compression, backup versus replication, storage options, storage tiering. There's so many ways that we're thinking about costs, because at the end of the day, I think we're extremely aware of the fact that bottom lines are really tight, especially heading into next year. And Veeam really wants to be a partner to make sure that we're helping you control and predict those costs. How did I do, Johan? Anything to add?
No, I think I can't say anything more.
You nailed it, Leo.
Oh my God.
That's perfect. And I think we'll wrap with and again, I do want to let everyone in the audience know that I know there's some questions that we haven't gotten to since we are pretty close to the end of time. We're going to leave it there, but we will make sure that all of the questions you ask go to Leah and Johan and the Veeam team. I love saying that. The Veeam team will get all of the questions that you ask, so you will get some follow-up responses back on those. Before you guys leave us today, though, if somebody out there is really excited and wanting to jump in with Veeam, as I'm sure a lot of folks are right now, what do they do? What's their first step?
So the first step will really be to chat with our team. And specifically, you can go to veeam.com and submit a general sales inquiry. However, if you are really invested already in Azure and you want to talk with Azure specialists, I've gone ahead and put the Azure team's email address specifically here, so you can cut straight to the source of the cloud experts we have on our sales teams. And in particular, we have an extensive systems engineering team. So if you're like, yeah, sales, whatever, I want to get to a demo, don't worry, they will get you set up right away with a custom demo to make sure that we're better understanding your environment. If you don't want to chat with somebody in sales yet, if you're like, gosh, that's a really big commitment, I encourage you to go to veeam.com and take a look at some of our customer success stories. We also have this really amazing set of forums, whether it's the Veeam community or even the R&D forums. That's where you can hear from current users. You could pose questions to them. You could say, hey, this is something I'm evaluating, and they'll help you out. They'll let you know your current experience. Because at the end of the day, Johan and I work for Veeam, so we're paid to tell you the good stuff, but I'm happy to point you to current users because we're super confident that they'll tell it like it is. And we're really excited for you to take a look and evaluate us.
Yeah, you can download a trial that way too, or go to Marketplace on Azure and download a trial if you're feeling really brave. But I like your idea better. Like, ask the customers that exist on the forums, like, what would I do? Because they usually give advice about other things that aren't Veeam related too. Like, I have this weird disk array and it needs to go this way. That kind of stuff you can get answered there too.
Yeah, especially because, again, we're storage agnostic. So they'll be able to really help you figure out, gosh, I'm like 50% in and out of Azure versus on-prem stuff. They're probably right there with you. So I think that's going to give you a really good experience. But as Johan said, free trials are absolutely an option. And on the Azure side specifically, you can go to the Azure Marketplace right now. The image is already loaded there for you. So you can spin it up, click through some wizards, and take a look.
I love that. Lots of great ways to get started. I think talking to customers is a fantastic way to move forward, and a great point there that, that's obviously folks that are going to be able to give you some more specific insight. For a second, Johan, when you said disk array, I thought you said disco array, and I got really excited about dealing with disco arrays. That sounds like a good time. Well, thank you guys so much, Leah and Johan. This has been an absolute pleasure. I know our audience has gotten a lot out of the conversation today. I really appreciate you both being here with us.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap it up. I do want to remind everyone out there in the audience that if you have not visited that handout section, please do head over there right now, because you can register, get that free ebook, 5 Azure backup and recovery must-haves, the on-demand webinar, Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure backup and recovery. Again, a great follow-up to the session we just had. The free edition of Veeam Backup and Microsoft Azure. You can also get that executive brief that Leo was just telling us about, that 2023 cloud protection trends. A super interesting read. I mean, as you saw, there's some really unique insight in there. So please do go check that out. Make sure you've downloaded that and save that to share later. I'm seeing some wonderful thank yous and high fives in the audience out there. I love that. Thank you all so much for that. And Leah and Johan, I'm sure, appreciate hearing those as well. And I do have a little bit more fun for us, so don't run away just yet, because we do have a prize giveaway. So today's winner is getting a $300 Amazon gift card. If they're here live at the webinar with us, not only do they get all the fun we just had, plus a $300 Amazon gift card, that's going to go to Sean Gaynor from Washington. Sean Gaynor of Washington. That's what we're going with. Congratulations to Sean. As always, we will be in touch about claiming your prize after we wrap the webinar today. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Veeam for making this webinar possible. A giant thank you to both Leah and Johan for taking us along on such an exciting kind of choose your own adventure style discussion today. I don't know about you guys, but I just absolutely loved that. And on that note, I want to again send a high five back to all of you out there in the audience with us today for making that possible. This webinar is a great example of the interesting and in-depth learning that can happen when we all pool our information, when we engage in these types of discussions together, and it really is exciting to be a part of that. So thank you to everyone who was involved in that today. I know that I've learned a ton from this session. My brain is all lit up, which is a great way to wrap up the week. I'm feeling very Friday and ready to head out into the weekend. I hope you all are as well. I can't wait to see you all on a webinar again soon. And until then, I hope you have an absolutely beautiful end to your day.